For as long as I can remember, someone somewhere has been shouting about games not being as good as they used to be. Many of us have personally experienced this feeling at times, but is there any truth to it? Are games getting worse, or could there be something else at play here? My first exposure to this sentiment came via mid-2000s Flash animation, with a web series called The Decline of Video Games. The first episode depicts a hypothetical future in the year 2059, where gaming has lost any sense of innovation, and publishers survive by recycling the same decades-old characters and IP to spin off uninspired garbage. That video was posted 20 years ago, so it begs the question, was it an accurate prediction? Are we experiencing the decline of video games? Today, I want to tackle this question from a slightly different angle. This is not going to be an objective analysis, because frankly, I can't imagine how anyone could pull that off. As you'll see, what little data we do have is probably not going to convince anyone one way or the other. Instead, we're going to pull back the curtain on the psychology behind this question. How might our brains make this kind of judgment? And what factors could be influencing our perception without us even realizing? These are the answers I was interested in. And what I found is critical to understanding how we form our views on the trajectory of the industry. If you've been feeling down about the state of gaming lately, your perception may be to blame. Ask a gamer what's wrong with the industry right now, and they probably won't hesitate before firing off a laundry list of common frustrations. You've heard them before: microtransactions, unfinished games, live service gold rush, AAA greed. These are the negative trends that have characterized the last 5+ years of gaming. And yeah, they do suck. As a community, we've consistently come together to speak out against these kinds of decisions that have tainted some of the franchises we know and love and sabotaged ones that were new to the scene. That is an important battle, and one we will continue to fight as consumers. But here's the thing. While these issues are real and frustrating, they don't define the entirety of gaming. I mean, how many games each year are tangibly affected by these negative trends? Is it dozens? Maybe. But hundreds? I am not so sure. It may feel like these problems are everywhere, but are they truly representative of the total gaming landscape? To put things in perspective, I looked at the volume of games published over the last decade. While there isn't good data for consoles, Steam provides a useful lens. According to Statista, the total number of games published on Steam has increased a staggering 2,000%, from 573 in 2013 to over 12,000 games in 2023. While many of these are small projects, early access games, and low-budget indies, they still reflect the incredible diversity and creativity in modern gaming. The sheer growth in titles can't be understated here. It means more games, more genres, and more options for us as players. Okay, so what about the biggest releases each year? The console exclusives and major IP. These are the games most covered by media and reviewers. And one of the cleaner data points we have on quality is Metacritic. From 2011 through 2022, the Metacritic average has steadily increased, climbing from just under 70 to about 75 out of 100. Now, before you go rushing to the comment section, I am not positioning this as proof that games are improving. Review scores, as we know, are far from perfect. But it does give us one data point that might challenge your existing perspective. And as we'll see shortly, everything about this question comes down to perspective. There's a common mechanic in strategy and exploration-based games called fog of war. This is a way for designers to obscure parts of the map that you haven't been to yet. And one effect is that you can often find yourself surprised at what was hidden from you just beyond the fog. Human perception works in a similar way. We have to make sense of the world with whatever information we have access to. But life rarely puts us in situations with no fog. Most often, the brain is left to fill in the blanks of our reality. And while it excels at this when the goal is simply survival, it tends to struggle more when accuracy is the objective. To understand how this mental fog affects our perception of the gaming industry, we have to look at the patterns our brains follow to make sense of imperfect information. This is the bias quadrant, and within it are 4 distinct forms of cognitive bias that can impact how we view the video game landscape. I'm going to briefly describe how this is organized, and then we're going to jump in and talk about why each one of these biases has the potential to distort our picture of reality. This quadrant is built on 2 axes. The vertical axis describes where the distortion comes from. Is it rooted in emotions like nostalgia or frustration, or does it stem from the mental shortcuts we rely on to process information logically? On the horizontal axis is the scope of the bias. The left side represents bias rooted in your personal experience, while the right is more grounded in collective perception, shaped by the stories and conversations happening across the gaming community. Together, these axes give us a frame to relate these biases, showing how they connect and overlap with each other. In the top left corner of the quadrant, we have impression bias, which deals with how we remember experiences. There are many types of cognitive biases related to memory, but the focus for this section is on something called the peak end rule. The easiest way to demonstrate this is with a quick exercise. So imagine one of your favorite video games. Now, once you have it, take a few seconds and try to remember how that game starts. What is the opening scene? How much detail can you recall? When I tried this, I completely forgot how The Witcher 3 started. In my head, the first scene of the game was Geralt and Vesemir chatting by the fire in White Orchard. Somehow, the iconic bathtub shot in Kaer Morhen had just completely vanished from my mind. This is where the peak end rule comes into play. Developed by psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who I introduced in my last video, the rule suggests that our brains don't evaluate experiences based on their entire duration. Instead, our impressions are formed by 2 key moments: the peak, where emotions are most intense, and the end, the part that happens last. One of the clearest demonstrations of this effect can be seen in the famous cold water experiment. Participants were asked to submerge their hands in a bowl of uncomfortably cold water, once for 60 seconds and once for 90 seconds. The only difference was that in the longer test, the experimenters slightly increased the temperature of the water for the final 30 seconds. When asked to choose which test they'd rather repeat, nearly 70% chose the longer one. The more tolerable ending had left many of the participants with a better overall impression of the 90-second test, even though they endured more total discomfort. If you struggled with that opening scene exercise like I did, the peak end rule might explain why. It suggests that your memory of a game isn't shaped by the entire journey. Instead, it's dominated by standout moments, the emotional highs of a story's climax, the frustration of a gritty boss fight, or the resolution of a satisfying ending. When you reflect on the games you've played from the past few years, what do you really remember about them? Are your impressions built on the average experience, or are they driven by those memorable peaks and final moments? Understanding how your memory forms impressions is the first step to clearing the fog around our question about the gaming industry. Next on the quadrant is visibility bias, which is another cognitive distortion related to memory. This bias occurs when we base our conclusions on the most noticeable, dramatic, or recent examples that we can think of, even if they're not representative of the whole picture. Here's an example. Imagine a friend asks you about crime in your neighborhood. What's the first thing you do? Most of us start searching our memory for any recent examples. If just a few days prior, a coworker told you their car was broken into in the same neighborhood, that story will likely jump to the front of your mind. And suddenly, crime might feel more rampant, even if that's not the reality. This mental shortcut, called the availability heuristic, is how our brains prioritize the most vivid and recent examples over a more balanced view of the facts. On the plus side, it is quick and efficient. Nobody has time to dig through every memory they've ever had. But this shortcut comes with a consequence. If something is easier to recall, our minds assume it's more frequent or significant than it really is. In 2024, the gaming industry saw a handful of high-profile disasters. These weren't normal failures. They were historic flops that dominated headlines and sparked tons of conversation within the community. Concord lasted just 2 weeks before Sony pulled the plug, putting them $400 million in the hole. Then there was Suicide Squad, Rocksteady's $200 million live service fumble that's closing shop less than a year after launch. And who could forget Skull and Bones, the first quadruple A game that cost Ubisoft upwards of $650 million over 10 years of development, only to ship to mediocre reviews and sales. With examples like these being so fresh, so dramatic, and so thoroughly discussed across the gaming community, it's no surprise that they're the first games that come to mind when we think about the state of the industry. They dominate the conversation, making it feel like failure is everywhere. But this is visibility bias at work. These headline-grabbing disasters aren't the full story. 2024 was also packed with some incredible games on both the indie and AAA scale. Yet, they don't hold quite the same weight in our memories. By understanding this bias, we can step back and see the bigger picture. Gaming isn't defined by a few loud failures. Instead, it's a mix of successes and missteps, where the quieter achievements often get drowned out by the noise. Moving to the bottom half of the quadrant, next up is prevalence bias. This refers to how our definition of good can shift as we encounter more examples of something. As a kid, I used to enjoy looking for seashells whenever my family would take beach vacations. I'd usually designate each pocket for a different tier of shell. I'd stash the nice shells in one pocket, but I would reserve the other for any perfect shells I found. At some point, I realized that I was following the same pattern with every excursion. I'd always start with more lenient criteria for the perfect pocket, but the more shells I picked up, the more particular I became about what qualified as perfect. This behavior might have been influenced by something called the blue dot effect, which is a reference to the experiment it came from. Participants were shown numerous dots on a spectrum from blue to purple and asked to identify which were blue. As fewer blue dots were shown, people started expanding their definition and began incorrectly labeling more purple dots as blue. Now, here's the interesting part for us. The inverse effect has also been observed. When the prevalence of a category increases, people can become more selective about what they include. In gaming, this tightening seems to be what's happening for many of us. Within the last 2 decades, the prevalence of high-quality games has skyrocketed. A single indie developer today could theoretically produce a game of the same quality as a major studio from the early 2000s. This is thanks to incredible advances in technology, game dev tooling, and general knowledge of effective game design principles. In short, our standards for what a good video game is continue to rise as we experience more of them. This might sound obvious. Like, of course our expectations are going to change if we see that the industry is consistently surpassing the quality bar from prior years. And yet, I think we often forget this when we reminisce about games from our youth. At the time, those games felt special because they were among the best. But that was when there were only a handful of blue dots on the page. Today, there are thousands of blue dots, each representing a game that would have qualified as great 10 or 20 years ago. But this prevalence of greatness can result in a bias toward the past. The last stop on our quadrant is adaptation bias. This is a close cousin to prevalence bias, and the primary mechanism that explains it is something called hedonic adaptation. Here's the fundamental idea. Each of us has a baseline level of happiness. This baseline isn't fixed, but it remains relatively stable over time for most of us. When we experience emotional highs like getting a raise, or emotional lows like going through a breakup, hedonic adaptation predicts that we'll eventually settle back to that baseline level of happiness, regardless of how intense those peaks were. When I first saw a PlayStation 2 in action, I was mesmerized. I loved our family's N64, but there was something so visceral about getting my hands on the DualShock controller and feeling that leap in technology. It was all I thought about for weeks, months, until I could convince my parents to buy one. I remember that same bewilderment when I eventually upgraded to the Xbox 360. With Xbox One, booting up for the first time was definitely exciting, although it didn't seem to linger as long. And with the Series X, the hype quickly faded as I realized it didn't have much to offer in terms of next-gen experiences. Hedonic adaptation suggests that any new console or game that we play will only boost our happiness for so long. And when the jumps in technology each generation are becoming less tangible over time, that means consumers will be even quicker to adapt back to their baseline levels. It's this dynamic that puts newer games in an even more challenging position, because they can no longer rely on the hardware advances alone to dazzle players. Even a mediocre game on PS2 was impressive compared to the N64. But as graphical fidelity seems to be plateauing, and the scope of games is arguably getting too large, for a modern game to stand out, it has to be excellent on its own 2 feet, innovating in areas like gameplay, art direction, and storytelling. And even if it can achieve this, players are often quick to make the jump to the next big thing around the corner. As I finish this script, 2024 is coming to a close, and what a fascinating year it's been for gaming. I posted my first video to this channel in January, less than 12 months ago, but in that time it feels like so much has happened. There were plenty of moments this year when the industry felt dire. Hearing about canceled games, studio closures, and mass layoffs were all true low points. But amidst all that, we still saw a staggering amount of great titles hit the market. My wish list ballooned this year. I was honestly getting frustrated at how many games were piquing my interest, because I know I won't have time for all of them. If there's one thing I hope you'll take away from our tour of the bias quadrant, it's that perception can mislead. Evaluating the question of whether we're truly seeing a decline of video gaming is not something that can be reliably accomplished with instinct. It requires a more deliberate examination and a conscious effort to make sense of our own imperfect memories. At the end of the day, you are entitled to your own opinion on the matter. There are certainly some trends that make me nervous for the future of this industry. But I've reckoned with my own perception enough to believe that there is much more to be optimistic about when it comes to gaming. So I'm putting my money on another fantastic year of games. I mean, have you seen the February release schedule? But That's just my take. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments how you think next year will shape up. And before we wrap, I need to give a proper thank you to everyone who has helped this channel get off the ground this year, and that includes you. I honestly could not have imagined the level of support and encouragement that I've received from this community so far. You guys leave some of the most thoughtful comments on my videos, and that's made it really easy for me to stay motivated and keep working on new content for you all. So genuinely, thank you for your support. As always, if you enjoyed the video or you learned something today, don't forget to leave a like or hit the subscribe button on the way out. I'll see you guys in the next one, and Happy New Year.